Hey there, sleepy travelers. Tonight we're slipping back into a time when books were as rare as a decent Wi-Fi signal in the middle of nowhere. Picture this. You're stepping into the Middle Ages, a world where reading isn't just something you do to pass the time. It's a privilege, a skill so exclusive. It's like being part of a secret society, minus the cool handshakes or fancy robes. Well, maybe some robes, but we'll get to that. This is a place where the written word is a treasure locked away in dusty monasteries, and your odds of learning to read are about as good as surviving a dragon attack. Spoiler alert, you're probably not making it out of this one, at least not literally speaking. Before you snuggle up under those blankets, do me a quick favor, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you're actually into this vibe. No pressure. Oh, and drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where you're all tuning in from. Got a fan going for that soft background hum perfect. Dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into this medieval journey together. So here you are, standing in a small medieval village. The air's thick with the smell of wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, a blacksmith's hammer clangs against an anvil. The sun's dipping low, painting long shadows across the thatched roofs and muddy paths. You glance around, no schools, no libraries, not even a sketchy little bookshop with overpriced parchment. The idea of curling up with a good book, that's as alien here as a smartphone buzzing in your pocket. Welcome to a world where literacy isn't just uncommon, it's practically mythical. Books in this era aren't like the paperbacks you've got stacked on your nightstand. They're rare, handcrafted treasures painstakingly copied by monks in quiet candlelit monasteries. Each page is a labor of love, or maybe just labor etched out, with quill and ink, often decorated with swirling illuminations that make them look more like art than something you'd actually read. But here's the catch: that beauty comes at a price. A single book could take months, sometimes years to finish, and the cost, think small fortune. Unless you're a wealthy noble or a big-shot clergyman, owning a book is about as likely as owning a castle, or at least the good parts of one. And it's not just the scarcity keeping literacy out of reach. There's the language barrier, too. Most of these precious manuscripts are written in Latin, the fancy tongue of the church, and the educated elite. Meanwhile, the average villager's chatting away in Old English, Middle French, or whatever local dialect they've got going. To them, Latin's as readable as hieroglyphics, or maybe a text from your boss in all caps. Learning to read doesn't just mean finding a book. It means cracking a whole foreign code, and that's a tall order when you're busy trying not to starve. So how rare was literacy exactly? Historians figure that in medieval Europe, only about 5 to 10% of folks could read and write. That's right, 9 out of 10. People couldn't even scribble their own name. But hold up, some scholars like to stir the pot here. They argue that number might be a bit too gloomy, pointing to scraps of evidence showing merchants, craftsmen, even a few peasants scratching out letters. Maybe literacy wasn't quite as dead as we think. Still, the big picture stays the same. Reading was mostly a VIP pass for the clergy and the nobility. Speaking of the clergy, let's shine a light on the church, because oh boy, do they own this story. In the Middle Ages, the church isn't just a place for Sunday sermons. It's the gatekeeper of knowledge. Monasteries and cathedrals double as the only schools around, where a lucky few, usually noble boys, get shipped off to study with monks and priests. The lesson plan: heavy on the Bible, light on everything else. If you're one of the chosen, your reading list is basically scripture and a side of religious commentary. No fantasy novels or spicy romances here, just God's word over and over until you can recite it in your sleep. Which honestly might not be a bad skill for tonight. But what about everyone else? The peasants, the backbone of this whole medieval gigdont, get an invite to the literacy party. They're out there from dawn to dusk, plowing fields, tending livestock, and praying the harvest doesn't flop. Education's a luxury and survival's the priority. Their knowledge comes from oral traditions, stories swapped over flickering fires, songs hummed while working proverbs that stick like burrs. It's practical stuff, passed down through generations, no parchment required. In a way, illiteracy isn't a failing, here it's just how the world spins. Even the nobles aren't all book smart. Sure, they've got more access than the muddy boot crowd, but plenty of them still can't read a lick. Why bother in a society where power comes from swinging a sword or shouting orders, the pen's not mightier than anything? A knight's worth is in his armor, not his ability to write a sonnet. Literacy's nice, but it's not the key to the kingdom unless that kingdom's a library, which, let's be real, it isn't. Here's a fun little nugget for you. Even some medieval kings weren't exactly scholars. Take Charlemagne big. Name big empire, big fan of learning. He pushed for education, built schools, all that jazz. But the guy himself could barely write. He could read a bit and sign his name, but putting quill to parchment was a struggle. If a king's fumbling with his letters, what chance does the average villager have? It's almost comforting, right? Even the top dogs weren't perfect. But let's not get too doom and gloom. There were bright spots, little pockets, where literacy popped up like wildflowers. In places like Italy, with its bustling trade cities, merchants needed to track their goods, and craftsmen had to read contracts. So in those urban corners, reading wasn't quite so mythical. Still, these are the exceptions, not the rule. For most, the written word stays a distant dream. Now picture this, a monk hunched over a desk in a chilly scriptorium, squinting by candlelight as he scratches out letters on parchment. That parchment, animal skin pricey, and a pain to prep. The ink a mix of weird stuff, like oak galls and iron salts, not exactly cheap either. One slip of the quill, and hours of work could be toast. When the book's done, it might get wrapped in leather, splashed with gold, even chained to a shelf, so no one swipes it. These aren't just books. They're heirlooms, status symbols, holy relics. No wonder they're out of reach. A single one could cost a year's wages or more. Your college textbooks feel like a steal now, huh? Speaking of costs, if you think your book budget's rough, imagine trading your horse, your plow, and maybe your kid brother for a shot at the Bible. That's medieval pricing for you. Books weren't just rare. They were a flex, a sign you'd made it. For the rest, the idea of owning one was pure fantasy, like us dreaming of a private island today. And here's a twist: things weren't always this sparse. Back in ancient Rome, literacy was more common, especially in cities. But when the empire crumbled, that know-how got buried, tucked away in monastic vaults. The Middle Ages didn't invent illiteracy. They just perfected it, turning knowledge into a guarded secret. So as the sun dips below the horizon and your village fades into shadow, you're left with this: a world where literacy's a gift wrapped up in religion, wealth, and power. But why was it so locked down? How did the church turn knowledge into its own private stash? That's where we're drifting next, nice and slow, just like this night. Stay with me. Picture yourself stepping into a medieval monastery, the kind of place where time seems to crawl. You're in a scriptorium, Now a big drafty room with stone walls that feel cold even in summer. The air's heavy with the smell of parchment ink and a hint of damp wool from the monks' robes. All around you, these silent figures are bent over their desks, quills scratching away like they're carving secrets into the animal hides spread out before them. Candlelight flickers throwing shadows that dance across the pages. It's almost hypnotic watching them work, one letter at a time, one painstaking stroke after another. This is where books come to life in the Middle Ages, born from sore hands and bleary eyes. But don't get too cozy. This isn't a library for everyone. This is the church's turf, and they're not exactly handing out free library cards. So why did the church have such a chokehold on knowledge back then? It's simple, really. Scripture was everything. The Bible wasn't just a book, it was the roadmap to heaven, the ultimate truth, and the church saw itself as the gatekeeper. If you couldn't read Latin, and trust me, your average farmer wasn't fluent, you were stuck relying on the priest to tell you what God had in mind. The church loved that setup. They got to play translator, spinning the message just so making sure it kept everyone in line. It wasn't just about saving souls. It was about power. Control the words, and you control the people. Imagine being handed a rule book you can't even read. Sounds frustrating, right? That was life for most folks in the Middle Ages. But hold up, let's not turn this into a villain origin story. The church wasn't twirling its mustache in some shadowy tower. Monasteries were also the superheroes of preservation, keeping ancient wisdom from crumbling into dust. While the world outside was a mess, think barbarian, invasions, collapsing empires, and the odd plague or two, these monks were busy copying down everything they could get their hands on. Roman law, Greek philosophy, even a few saucy poems. If they were lucky, it all got a second life, thanks to their efforts. Without them, we'd be missing huge chunks of history. So yeah, the church kept knowledge on a leash, but they also made sure it didn't vanish entirely. A bit of a mixed bag, those monks. Still don't expect a medieval public school system? Education was a VIP club, and the guest list was short. If you weren't a noble with a fancy title or a kid destined for a priest's collar, you weren't getting in. Monasteries and cathedral schools were the only game in town, and they catered to a select crowd. The curriculum, let's just say, it wasn't winning any awards for variety. You get Latin because God apparently didn't speak the local tongue, plus a heavy dose of scripture and maybe some basic math if you were lucky. It was like a boot camp for your soul, designed to churn out loyal servants of the church. No art classes, no field trips, just a steady grind of holy texts. For the rest of society, the message was clear: stick to plowing fields and leave the thinking to the pros. Now let's zoom in on those books the monks were slaving over. These weren't your paperback beach reads. Every page was a marathon parchment made from sheepskin or calfskin, scraped and stretched until it was smooth as glass. The ink, a homemade brew of crushed oak galls, iron salts, and who knows what else cooked up in some monk's backroom lab. Writing it all out took hours, days, sometimes months, with no delete key to save you from a mistake. Spill a drop or smudge a line, and you might as well cry into your bowl of gruel. These books were so precious, they'd chain them to shelves literally. Picture that, a library where the books are bolted down like prisoners. They were rare, expensive, and treated like holy relics, which in a way they were. And here's a fun twist: the monks weren't robots. They'd sneak little notes into the margins like medieval post-its. Flip through an old manuscript, and you might find one grumbling, "Thank God this page is done." or my hand's so cold I can't feel it. One guy even wrote, writing is excessive drudgery. It's a wonder I haven't lost my mind. It's like catching a monk mid-rant, a tiny rebellion against the endless task. These scribbles are gold proof that even the holiest of scribes had their breaking points. Next time you're slogging through a tough day, just think at least you're not copying Leviticus by candlelight with frozen fingers. So was the church, trying to keep everyone in the dark on purpose. That's the million-dollar question, and historians still bicker about it. Some say the church hoarded literacy, like a dragon with gold, deliberately keeping the masses ignorant to stay on top. Others argue it wasn't malice, just practicality. The Middle Ages were rough. Most people were too busy surviving to care about reading. The church was the only outfit with the resources to teach anyone, and they focused on training their own crew priests, monks, the occasional Lord's son. But here's the kicker. They didn't exactly push to widen the circle. Literacy stayed a luxury like silk or spices, while the average Joe got by on sermons and prayers he couldn't even read himself. That said, there were glimmers of hope. Take Charlemagne, the big-shot king, who ruled in the late 700s. He teamed up with a brainy monk named Alcuin to shake things up. Alcuin wanted schools everywhere, not just in monasteries, dreamed of a world where more people could crack open a book. It wasn't a total revolution. Peasants weren't suddenly reciting poetry, but it planted seeds. Cathedral schools started popping up, and a few more kids got a shot at learning. Progress was slow, though, glacial even. The church system was too entrenched, too comfy in its role as the keeper of all things written. For the everyday person, this meant life without letters. Your world was oral stories swapped over a fire sermons, booming from the pulpit songs drifting through the village. Books were for the elite, glowing with a kind of magic you couldn't touch. Imagine being told there's this incredible thing called writing, but it's locked away in a language you don't speak, guarded by men in robes. Frustrating? Sure, but it also made the spoken word king. People got creative, tales grew wilder, memories sharper. The church might have owned the page, but the people owned the air. Here's another curveball. Even some priests weren't great readers. The higher-ups in the church bishops' abbots, they had the skills. But your local village priest, he might be memorized his lines like a bard, stumbling through Latin he half understood. These guys were the front line preaching to the flock, yet plenty of them were barely literate themselves. It's like trusting a chef who's never tasted his own cooking. The system worked, sort of, but it was rickety held together by faith habit and a lot of crossed fingers. Step back into that scriptorium for a sec. You're watching those monks, their quills moving like metronomes. And it hits you. This is a world of contradictions. The church is a fortress of learning, shielding knowledge from the storm outside, but it's also a cage keeping it out of reach. They're heroes and gatekeepers all at once, saving the past while stifling the present. It's a slow dance, beautiful, maddening, and totally medieval. But we're not done yet. The monastery's walls are starting to feel tight, aren't they? Good thing there's a whole world beyond them, where words don't need ink to live. Next up, we'll trade the quill for the voice, stepping into the wild, vibrant realm of oral tradition. So shake off the dust, leave the parchment behind, and let's head out, where the real stories are told, under the open sky, with nothing but a fire and a good yarn to keep us warm. You're still here, huddled by that medieval fire, the glow warming your face as the night deepens around you. The storyteller's voice rises and falls, painting pictures of heroes and tricksters, while the crowd leans in, hanging on every word. There's no scroll in sight, no quill, scratching parchment, just the rhythm of speech, the crackle of logs, and the occasional hoot of an owl overhead. This is the heartbeat of the Middle Ages, where oral tradition doesn't just survive, it thrives, shaping how people think, learn, and connect. Let's dig deeper into why the spoken word ruled supreme and how it turned a world without books into a tapestry of sound and memory. Imagine trying to get your hands on a book back then. It's not like you could stroll into a medieval bookstore. Those didn't exist. Books were rare, almost mythical objects crafted by hand over months or even years. Picture a monk, bleary-eyed and ink-stained, hunched over a desk in a chilly scriptorium, copying every letter with a feather quill. One mistake, and he's starting over. That kind of effort didn't come cheap. A single manuscript could cost more than a peasant's yearly wages, and that's if you could even find one for sale. Most were hoarded by the church or the elite, tucked away in stone-walled libraries where dust gathered faster than readers. For you standing by this fire, a book might as well be a unicorn, beautiful rumored to exist, but not something you'll ever touch. So the spoken word steps in, filling the gap with stories that don't need a binding to hold them together. And it's not just about the lack of book sits, the whole rhythm of life. You're a villager, and your days are a grind of mud and muscle. Sunrise to sunset, you're out there wrestling with a plow or chasing down a runaway sheep. There's no summer break, no literacy classes popping up at the local tavern. Learning to read, that's a pipe dream, when your biggest worry is whether the harvest will last through winter. Besides, who's going to teach you? The priest might know his letters, but he's busy saving souls, not running a school. Literacy's a privilege, and unless you're born with a silver spoon, or a monk's robe, it's not on the table. Instead, you soak up what you need from the voices around you, a farmer's rhyme about when to sow a neighbor's tale about dodging the Lord's taxes. It's knowledge you can use delivered straight to your ears, no homework required. The church, though, adds another layer to this tale. They're the gatekeepers of the written word, but they're not above a little showmanship. Step into a dim, echoing cathedral, and you'll see what I mean. The priest isn't just reading from a dusty tome, has preaching, gesturing, turning dry Latin into something that sticks. Sermons were the blockbuster events of the day, full of fire and brimstone drama, or gentle parables depending on the mood. And hymns, they're the medieval earworms, catchy enough to hum while you're milking the cows. The church knew most of you couldn't read a lick, so they leaned into oral tradition, hard making faith a performance you didn't need a book to follow. It's clever, really. They controlled the text, but shared the stories, keeping everyone in the loop without handing over the keys to the library. But let's zoom out from the practical stuff for a second. Oral tradition wasn't just a workaround, it was a masterpiece of its own. Think of the wandering minstrels, those rock stars of the dirt roads strumming lutes and spinning tales of love and war. Their songs weren't written down. They lived in the air, passed from one voice to the next like a well-worn coin. Or picture a mother teaching her kids a proverb a stitch, and time saves ninny a little nugget of wisdom wrapped in a phrase you can't forget. These weren't throwaway lines. They were the glue of a culture holding together everything from family lore to ancient battles. And the best part, they were flexible. A story might grow a new twist, depending on who's telling it. Maybe the wolf gets smarter, or the hero gets a funnier sidekick. It's like a living script, rewritten every night by the fire, and you're part of the cast. Here's a fun fact to chew on. Some of those old tales are still kicking around today, hiding in plain sight. Ever sing London Bridge is Falling Down? That ditty's got medieval DNA, possibly tied to Viking raids or crumbling infrastructure historians still bicker about it. Or how about Jack and Jill? It might be started as a cheeky jab at a king and queen who couldn't keep their crowns on straight. These snippets of oral tradition are like time travelers slipping through centuries to land in your childhood. They're proof of how sticky a good story can be. Tell it right, and it'll outlast castles and kings. So next time you hum one of those tunes, tip your hat to the Middle Ages. They're still whispering in your ear. Now, not everyone's on board with giving oral tradition a gold star. Some scholars wag their fingers and say, hold up, how reliable is this stuff? Fair question. Without a written record, stories can morph like a game of whisper down the lane. A warrior's brave stand might turn into a full-on dragon-slaying epic after a few retellings. But here's the flip side: communities had a knack for keeping the core truth intact. If a tale mattered, say, where the best fishing spot was, or who owned what land, people double-checked it, corrected it, kept it sharp. Compare that to a monk nodding off mid-copy swapping left for right in a land deed. Written records weren't flawless either. So maybe oral tradition's not perfect, but it's got grit, held its own in a world that couldn't afford to forget. What's wild is how inclusive it all was. You didn't need to be a scholar or a lord to join the party. Everyone's invited, young, old, rich, poor. The fire's warm, the stories are free, and all you need is a pair of ears. It's a shared wealth, a kind of currency that doesn't care about your rank. In a time when power was a pyramid with the king at the top and you somewhere near the muddy bottom, that's a big deal. Oral tradition leveled the field, at least for a night, letting every voice weave into the tapestry. It's messy, sure, but it's alive, pulsing with the energy of everyone who tells it. Still, it's not all rosy. Stories could vanish if the last teller forgot the words, and they weren't great for pinning down the fine printry, reciting a tax code by heart. Writing had its perks. It just wasn't for the masses yet. But for now, by this fire, oral tradition's king. It's your teacher, your bard, your late-night radio, all in one. And as the embers fade and the voices soften, you feel that this world's alive with words, even without a page in sight. But don't drift off just yet. Up next, we're peeling back the layers of feudalism, where your spot in the lineup decides if you'll ever crack a book. The tale's still unfolding, so stick around. Picture yourself trudging through a muddy medieval village. The air is a cocktail of wood smoke, damp earth, and that unmistakable whiff of livestock. You're surrounded by folks going about their day, some haggling over turnips, others hauling water from a creaky well. But here's the catch. Everyone's got a role, and it's written in stone. You don't get to choose your part in this play. It's handed to you at birth, wrapped up in the feudal system, like a not-so-giftable present. And if you're hoping to sneak a peek at a book or learn your ABCs, well, unless you're born with a silver spoon, or at least a noble's title, you're out of luck. Let's zoom out and see how this works. Feudalism's like a cosmic org chart, with a king perched at the top, twirling his scepter and collecting taxes. Below him, you've got the nobles, fancy lords, with sprawling estates, swearing allegiance to the crown while sipping from goblets. Then there's the knights, all clanking armor and chivalry, ready to ride for their lords. And at the bottom, holding it all up, are the peasants and serfs you. And most everyone you know tied to the land, growing the food that keeps this whole pyramid from toppling. It's a system built on order, loyalty, and knowing your place. Education, though that's not part of the peasant package. So, how does this rigid setup keep learning out of reach? Easy, it's all about access. And access is a privilege, not a free-for-all. If you're a noble's kid, life's a golden ticket. You might get packed off to a cathedral school or a monastery where stern monks teach you Latin scripture and how to impress at a banquet. It's not exactly fun. Imagine copying manuscripts by candlelight until your hand cramps, but it's a ticket to power. Now, if you're a peasant, your school's a patch of dirt, your teacher's the seasons, and your homework's making sure the harvest doesn't flop. Reading and writing. That's for the folks in fancy robes, not for you. The clergy's where it gets interesting. Monks and priests aren't just praying all day, they're the medieval librarians hoarding knowledge like dragons with gold. Monasteries and cathedral schools are the hot spots for learning, but they've got a strict guest list. Unless you're training to join their ranks or your families, got land to spare, you're not getting past the door. These places churn out educated elites, think future bishops or noble advisors, while the rest of the world stays in the dark. It's like an exclusive club, and the passwords either holy orders or lordship. Want a wild twist? Some noble kids didn't even stay home for their education. They got fostered. Picture this. You're a 10-year-old noble, shipped off to live with another lord's family. It's like a medieval boarding school, but with more swordplay and fewer hugs. You'd learn manners, fighting skills, and maybe a smidge of reading enough to keep the family name shiny. It's a quirky perk of the upper crust, a way to network and toughen up. Meanwhile, down in the village, the closest you get to fostering is babysitting the neighbor's goat. Here's a hard fact to chew on. Only about 5 to 10% of people in the Middle Ages could read or write. That's 9 out of 10 folks who'd look at a page and see squiggles, not stories. Feudalism's to blame. It kept education, a rare gem, polished for the elite and buried from the masses. But wait, there's a wrinkle. Some historians nudge that number up a bit. In busy towns, merchants and craftsmen might scribble basic notes, think tallies, or signatures. It's not Shakespeare, but it's something. Still, the big truth holds learning's a luxury, and the feudal system's the bouncer keeping most of us out. Why keep it so exclusive, power, plain and simple? If you're a lord, you don't want your serfs getting ideas. A peasant who reads might wonder why they're stuck shoveling manure while you're counting coins in your castle. Knowledge is a spark, and feudalism's not about starting fire sits, about keeping the status quo nice and chilly. So the nobles and clergy clutch the reins, passing books and quills among themselves like family heirlooms. Don't get me wrong, there's a silver lining, sort of. Some nobles play the hero tossing coins to monasteries to keep the monks scribbling. And the clergy, they're the unsung MVPs, copying old Roman texts and keeping a flicker of wisdom alive. It's not democracy, but it's not total blackout either. For you, though, in that muddy village, it's a distant glow, pretty to look at, impossible to touch. Back in the marketplace, you're watching this world tick by. A knight clops past on his horse armor, gleaming, probably illiterate, but definitely intimidating. A monk shuffles by nose in a scroll, muttering prayers. You've got a sack of grain and a head full of song-sorrel traditions, your education, and it's not half bad. But try arguing a tax dispute with a ballad. Good luck. Even up the ladder, literacy's spotty. Plenty of knights and lesser nobles can't spell sword, let alone write it. In their world, muscle trumps manuscripts. It's another layer of the feudal cake. Education's a bonus, not a baseline. even for the not quite top tier. The systems, a maze and learning's the prize at the center, reachable only by a few. But hold on, there's a shift brewing. In places like Italy, where ships dock and coins clink, merchants are shaking things up. These traders need to read ledgers, sign deals, and maybe sass a competitor in writing. Literacy's sneaking in, not as a noble gift, but a practical tool. It's a slow burn, a hint of what's to come, but in your village, it's still a whisper on the wind. As dusk settles, the marketplace quiets. You're left with a nagging thought. What if everyone could learn? What if the pyramid cracked open just a little? It's a dream for another day. For now, feudalism's got its grip tight, and education's a treasure locked away. But don't drift off yet. Next up, we're tackling why books cost a fortune, piling another brick on this wall of inaccessibility. So keep your ears open, and let's dive into the pricey world of parchment. Picture yourself stepping into a medieval scriptorium. It's a chilly stone room, lit only by flickering candles, and the weak glow of daylight sneaking through narrow windows. Monks sit at wooden desks, their robes brushing the floor heads bowed over sheets of parchment. The air hums with the faint scratch of quills and the occasional creak of a stool. This isn't just a workplace, it's a sanctuary where books are born, each one a miracle of effort and time. But miracles don't come cheap, and in the Middle Ages, owning a book was like owning a slice of the moon. Let's start with what these books were made of. Forget paper, that's a modern luxury. And in medieval Europe, it was still a rare import from far-off lands. Instead, you've got parchment, which sounds fancy until you realize it's animal skin. Sheep, goats, calves, they all donated their hides to the cause. Making parchment wasn't a quick trip to the stationery store. First, you'd skin the animal, hope you've got a strong stomach. Then you'd soak the hide in a nasty mix of lime and water. To loosen the hair, scrape it clean with a curved blade, stretch it tight on a frame, and polish it smooth with a stone. One wrong move, and you've got a holy mess instead of a page. A decent-sized book might need 50 or 100 skins, so before a single word was written, you were already deep in the red. Then there's the ink. You couldn't just grab a pen off the shelf. Medieval ink was a DIY project. Think of it as a recipe your weird uncle might whip up. Scribes crushed gallnuts, those lumpy growths on oak trees, mixed them with iron salts, and stirred in some vinegar or stale wine. It took hours to get the balance right, and if it wasn't perfect, it did either clump up or fade away. This wasn't ink you could mass produce. It was a small batch craft like artisanal coffee, but way less fun to drink. Every drop was precious, and every spill was a tragedy. Now imagine the work itself. A scribe sits down with a quill, usually a goose feather, sharpened to a point, and starts copying. Letter by letter, word by word, page by page. A short book might take weeks. A long one, like a Bible, could eat up a year or more. And this isn't mindless typing. One slip-a-smudge, a misspelling, a wobbly line, and you're in trouble. You might scrape the mistake off with a knife, leaving a thin spot on the parchment, or you might have to redo the whole page. It's backbreaking, eye-straining work, and the monks didn't even get a coffee break. They were fueled by faith duty, and maybe the promise of a warm supper. But the cost didn't stop at parchment and ink. Some books were more than just words, they were masterpieces. Illuminated manuscripts, dazzled with colors, and gold turning pages into miniature paintings. Scribes and artists teamed up, adding borders of twisting vines, tiny saints, or cheeky little monsters. The colors came from crushed stones and plants lapis lazuli for blue malachite, for green ground into pigments, and mixed with egg yolk or gum. And that gold, real gold, pounded into whisper-thin sheets and laid on with a steady hand. Every flourish added hours, days, even weeks to the clock, jacking up the price to astronomical levels. So what did this all cost? In today's terms, a plain manuscript might set you back a few grand. A fancy, illuminated one, think tens of thousands or more. Back then, it was less about coins and more about what you could trade. A book could cost as much as a plot of land, a herd of sheep, or a year's wages for a skilled worker. Libraries didn't lend these out. They chained them to the shelves. Literally, iron chains clanking against the wood, because a book was worth more than your average thief could dream of. Lose one, and you're not just out a story, you're out a fortune. Who could afford this? The rich and powerful mostly. Nobles decked out their castles with a few volumes to impress their guests. Bishops and abbots stocked their churches and monasteries, showing off their devotion and their deep pockets. For regular folks like you or me, books were a fantasy. You might hear a priest read from one during Mass, the words floating down from the pulpit, but holding it yourself. That's like asking to borrow the king's scepter. Books were power, prestige, and privilege, all bound up in calf skin. Here's a fun twist, though. Scribes weren't always the solemn types you might imagine. Sometimes they'd sneak little surprises into the margins doodles of rabbits' nights fighting snails. Seriously, snails were a medieval meme, or grumpy notes about their day. One scribe scribbled, "This parchment is Harry'm done." Another begged, "Please, someone bring me a beer." These bits of marginalia are like medieval post-it notes, proof that even in the quiet scriptorium, people found ways to laugh vent, or just doodle their boredom away. The price of books wasn't just about money, though, it was about control. Knowledge was a weapon, and the people with the keys to the scriptorium held the power. The church ran the show, deciding what got copied and who got to read it. Monasteries churned out religious texts, histories, and laws, while anything too radical might get quietly ignored. By keeping books scarce, they kept ideas in check. It's not a conspiracy, it's just how things worked. If you control the page, you control the story. Scholars love to argue about what this meant for literacy. Some say only a tiny elite, maybe 1 or 2%, could read, mostly priests and nobles. Others think it wasn't that bleak, pointing to merchants and clerks who learned enough to keep their businesses humming. Townsfolk might have picked up a few words too, especially where trade was booming. But even if you could read, good luck getting your hands on a book. It's like knowing how to drive, but not having a car or a road. The cost kept books out of reach, and that shaped everything about how people learned and lived. That's where the spoken word came in. With books so rare, stories didn't sit on shelves, they danced from mouth to mouth. Around a fire in a tavern on a dusty road, people told tales, sang songs, and shared news. It was cheaper than parchment, faster than a quill, and didn't need a monastery to make it happen. Oral tradition wasn't just a fallback, it was a lifeline, keeping knowledge alive when the written word was locked away. You didn't need gold to hear a good story. You just needed ears. Back in the scriptorium, the monks keep scratching away their quills, tracing lines that'll outlast them. Each book is a triumph, a fragile bridge between minds across centuries. But it's a bridge few can cross. As you watch, you might wonder what it'd be like if books weren't so precious, if they could spill out into the world like water from a broken dam. That day's coming slow, but sure, with whispers of ink and machines on the horizon. For now, though, the candle burns low, the parchment glows, and the price of a book remains a king's ransom. Sleep tight, there's more to this tale tomorrow. Close your eyes and step into a medieval scriptorium. The air hums with a faint musty tang parchment and ink mingling like an ancient perfume. Candlelight flickers, casting long shadows across wooden desks where monks sit hunched and silent their quills, scratching out a rhythm as old as the stone walls around them. Each letter they form is a tiny triumph, each page a marathon. This is how books came to life in the Middle Ages behand with patience that could outlast a winter storm. No printing press, no whirring machines, just human hands and a whole lot of grit. And that, dear listener, is why books were rarer than a sunny day in a British bog. Let's rewind a bit. In the last section, we talked about how books cost a fortune more than most people could dream of owning. Now, let's dig into why. It all starts with the raw stuff of a book, the writing surface. You might picture paper stacked neatly in a shop, but paper was a latecomer to this party, trickling into Europe from far-off lands like a shy guest. The real star was parchment animal skin, tough and leathery. Making it was no picnic. Picture this. You'd skin a sheep or calf. Sorry little lamb, soak the hide in a stinky lime bath to loosen the hair, then stretch it tight on a frame. Next came the scraping hours with a curved knife to peel off every last bit of fuzz, followed by sanding until it was smooth as a noble's cheek. One book could gobble up dozens of skins. It was a messy, costly business, and that was just step one. Then there's the ink. No running to the store for a bottle here. Scribes brewed their own like medieval alchemists. They'd crush oak galls, those knobby growths you see on trees, mix them with iron salts and a dash of gum arabic, and stir until it was just right. Too gloopy and your quill clogged. Too runny and it bled through the page like a bad rumor. Every drop was a small treasure, and spilling it. That was a tragedy worthy of a monkish sigh. Now, the real magic or madness happened when the scribe sat down to work, armed with a quill, usually a goose feather sharpened to a wicked point. They'd copy texts letter by letter. A short book might take weeks. A hefty tome like a Bible could steal a year or more. These weren't just any scribblers either. Scribes were skilled pros, often monks, who'd spent years mastering Latin and the art of calligraphy. One wobbly line, one smudged word, and you'd either scrape it off, risking a hole in your precious parchment, or start over. It was slow, eye-aching work, and the only soundtrack was the rustle of vellum and the occasional cough from Brother Bernard in the corner. But wait, there's more. Some books weren't just words, they were art galleries. Illuminated manuscripts glowed with color and gold thanks to a tag team effort. After the scribe finished, an illuminator swooped in, painting elaborate initials swirling borders and tiny scenes of saints or dragons. They'd grind pigments from stone slapies for blue malachite for green and mix them with egg yolk to make them stick. Gold leaf, hammered thin as a whisper, got pressed onto the page with a steady hand. Each decoration was a time sink, turning a book into a masterpiece but also a money pit. Beauty didn't come cheap. Let's put some numbers on this. A single Bible copied by hand could take a scribe over a year. The price, think a year's wages for a skilled craftsman, or the cost of a small farm. Even big libraries like those in monasteries or universities might only boast a few dozen books. These weren't casual reads. They were treasures. In some places, they chained books to the shelves to stop sticky-fingered scholars from nabbing them. Imagine borrowing a novel today and finding it bolted down talk about a trust issue. Here's a quirky tidbit to lighten the mood. Some manuscripts have doodles in the margins. Bored scribes stuck on page 300 of a 500-page slog might sketch a cat or a grumpy face. One even scrawled, "Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink." It's a little peek into their world proof that even holy men had their limits. These books weren't just objects. They were slices of someone's life etched in ink and exhaustion. So what did this mean for knowledge? Without a printing press, ideas crawled across the map. A brilliant new theory in Paris might take decades to reach Rome, carried by hand-copied pages and weary travelers. It was like mailing a letter with no post office, slow, unreliable, and prone to getting lost. Learning stayed local, with each region cooking up its own flavor of wisdom. And education, that suffered too. Books were so scarce that students often shared a single copy, huddling around it like moths to a flame, or listened as a teacher read aloud, memorizing every word. No backpacks stuffed with textbooks, here just sharp ears and sharper memories. Fast forward to the 15th century, and the printing press changed everything. Books went from rarities to regulars, churned out fast and cheap. But in the Middle Ages, that was a fairy tale. Every page was a Herculean effort, and that kept them out of most hands. Which brings us to literacy. With books so pricey, and few, only the elite monks, nobles, the occasional rich merchant could touch them. For the average farmer or baker, a book might as well have been a dragon's egg, mythical and unreachable. Literacy stayed locked up with the lucky few, a privilege tied to wealth and power. And that's where our story bends toward the next chapter. Because books were so hard to come by, education became a golden ticket handed out to those with the means or the church's blessing. But we'll save that tale for tomorrow night. As you sink into your pillow, picture those scribes' quills dancing in the dim glow, their work a lifeline for knowledge in a world that moved at a snail's pace. Think of the last book you held, its pages crisp and plentiful. Now imagine it as a lone survivor, one of a handful, its words scratched out by a tired hand centuries ago. It's a quieter, stranger time, isn't it? A place where every story was a prize worth more than gold. So you've just wandered out of the last section, where books were rarer than a dragon's tooth and cost more than a peasant's yearly haul of turnips. No printing press meant no mass-produced pages, and that kept literacy locked up tight in the hands of the elite. But what about the next step, education? If you thought getting your hands on a book was tough, try imagining a world where learning to read it was a privilege dangled just out of reach for most. Buckle up, because we're diving into the Middle Ages exclusive education club where the guest list was short, the dress code was strict, and the common folk weren't even allowed to peek through the window. Let's set the scene. It's a chilly morning somewhere in medieval Europe, say around 1100. The roosters are crowing, the village is stirring, and a kid named Edwin is trudging up a muddy path toward a hulking stone monastery. He's got a wool cloak, a sack with some bread, and a nervous grin. Edwin's dad is a minor lord with a bit of land and a decent herd of sheep. So Edwin's won the medieval lottery, a shot at education. Down in the village, his pals are already mucking stables or chasing chickens. For them, school's as mythical as a unicorn, just a story they'll never live. Here's the deal. Education back then wasn't a public service. It was a luxury good like silk or spices, and the church held the keys. Monasteries and cathedral schools were the hot spots for learning, but don't picture a welcoming red schoolhouse with a bell. These were somber, echoing places where monks in rough robes drilled knowledge into a lucky few. The vibe, think less inspiring teacher and more drill sergeant with a holy book. And the guest list was exclusive boys only please, and preferably from noble families or headed for a priest's collar. If you were a peasant, your odds of getting in were about as good as winning a joust against a fully armored knight on your first try. Step inside one of these medieval classrooms with me. The air's thick with the smell of damp stone and candle wax. A dozen boys, ages 8 to maybe 14, perch on wooden benches, clutching wax tablets and styluses. A monk looms at the front, his voice a low drone as he recites Latin phrases. The boys scribble along, trying not to smudge their work, because if they do, they'll feel the sting of a ruler on their knuckles. Today's lesson might be a psalm, a chunk of grammar, or a debate about whether angels have wings. Spoiler, it's a trick question. No colorful maps, no science experiments, just a relentless grind of Latin scripture and the odd bit of math. It's not about sparking dreams. It's about forging tools for the church and the nobility. Who's in the room? Mostly sons of lords. Barons or knights' kids like Edwin, destined to manage estates or advise kings. A few are there to climb the church ladder, maybe dreaming of a cushy gig as an abbot someday. Girls, they're mostly out of luck. A noble daughter might learn her letters at home, but it's more about running a manor than wrestling with theology. And if you're a peasant boy or girl forgets it, your education's the rhythm of the seasons, sow, reap, repeat. The system's rigged to keep the powerful powerful and the rest in the dark, literally and figuratively. But wait, there's a twist. Not all learning was locked in stone walls. Out in the bustling towns, some kids dodged the classroom entirely and went straight to work. Picture a wiry lad named Jack apprenticed to a blacksmith. He's hammering red-hot iron, learning the trade by sweat and grit. Or maybe it's Alice shadowing a weaver, mastering the loom's clack and hum. These apprenticeships taught skills, real hands-on stuff, but books, reading, that's a no-go. Jack might learn to mark his tools or tally a sale, but he's not cracking open Beowulf anytime soon. It's practical, over scholarly survival, over sonnets. Let's zoom out for a second. How many people could actually read back then? Historians love to argue about this, but the rough guess is 5 to 10%. That's right, 9 out of 10 folks would stare at a page and see gibberish. In a village of 100, maybe 5, could decipher a letter, and they'd probably be the priest, the Lord's clerk, and a couple of oddballs who got lucky. But here's where it gets messy in growing towns. Where trade was king, some merchants and craftsmen picked up the basics. We're talking scribbled ledgers, not libraries. Think buy 2 pigs, owe 3 shillings, rather than once upon a time. Still, the big picture's clear. Literacy was a golden ticket, and most folks never even saw the raffle. Why so stingy with the smart's power, my friend? Knowledge is a weapon, and the church and nobles weren't about to arm the masses. Imagine a peasant who can read the Bible himself. Next thing you know, he's asking why the priest got a fancier house than he does. Or a tenant farmer decoding a tax roll and wondering where all his grain's going. Nope. Better to keep the book shut and the questions muffled. Education was rationed out just enough to keep the machine humming priests, to pray clerks, to count lords to rule. Everyone else stay in your lane, preferably the muddy one. But hold on, there's a flicker of hope in this dim tale. Some monasteries, bless their stone hearts, cracked the door open with charity schools. A handful of local boys, usually the sharp ones, might get a taste of letters, a rare chance to climb out of the muck. And in places like Italy, where merchants were raking in coin, the demand for practical skills started to shift the sands. They didn't need monks chanting psalms. They needed clerks who could balance books and write contracts. It's not a tidal wave of change, but it's a ripple, a hint that the world might someday turn a page. Picture Edwin again stumbling down the hill as the sun dips low. His head stuffed with Latin nouns, his fingers cramped from writing. He's tired, but he's got something the village kids don't, a key to a bigger world, even if it's just a crack. Back in the village, the day's winding down. Smoke curls from chimneys, and the unlettered hum of daily life settles in. What if everyone could hold that key? What if the gate swung wide? It's a wild thought too big for now. For the moment, the monastery looms above its walls, guarding secrets and shaping minds one privileged soul at a time. Speaking of monasteries, they're more than just schools. They're the beating heart of medieval learning. Next time, we'll slip inside those walls to see how they kept knowledge alive from dusty scrolls to whispered prayers. So don't drift off, yet the story's got more twists to come. Keep those ears perked, so you're still standing in the scriptorium, the air thick with the smell of ink and old parchment. Brother Cedric is still at it, his quill scratching away like a tiny soldier marching across the page. You can feel the weight of history in this room. Every word he writes is a thread tying the past to the future. But as you linger, you start to notice something else. The stillness isn't just peaceful. It's isolating. These walls don't just protect knowledge, they hoard it. And that the story we're digging into now, how monasteries, for all their heroism, kept learning on a short leash, and what that meant for the world outside. Let's rewind a bit. After Rome fell, Europe was a mess, think of it, like a giant library after a hurricane. Books were scattered, burned, or just forgotten as people scrambled to survive. Monasteries became the cleanup crew, gathering what was left and locking it away in their stone towers. They didn't just save religious texts either. Picture a monk painstakingly copying Euclid's geometry, or Galen's medical theories, his candle flickering as the night deepens. These weren't just holy men. They were the last line of defense against a world slipping into ignorance. By the 8th century, places like the monastery at St. Gall in Switzerland or Monte Cassino in Italy were buzzing with this quiet, nerdy energy scribbling away while the rest of Europe rebuilt. But here's where it gets tricky. Saving knowledge is one thing, sharing it is another. Monasteries weren't exactly handing out library cards. Most of these books stayed right where they were written, chained to desks or tucked into locked chests. Why? Well, for starters, books were crazy expensive. A single manuscript could take months to copy, sometimes years if it was fancy with gold leaf or illustrations. The parchment alone was a fortune made from animal hides that had to be scraped, stretched, and dried just right. Add in the ink, the labor, and the fact that only a handful of people could even read, and you've got a treasure rarer than gold. So the monks guarded it like dragons sitting on a hoard. And who got to peek at this hoard? Not you, unless you were part of the club-meaning clergy, or the occasional noble who could pay for the privilege. The church wasn't trying to be mean. It was just how things worked. Monasteries were built to serve God, not the masses. Their mission was to train priests, preserve scripture, and keep the faith alive. Educating peasants wasn't on the to-do list. Plus, Latin was the language of the game, and it was a high wall between the monks and everyone else. Imagine trying to crash a party where everyone's speaking a secret code. You'd feel pretty left out, right? That's what it was like for most people in the Middle Ages. Now let's flip through one of these manuscripts. You'd see neat rows of text, maybe some colorful initials, or a drawing of a saint looking suitably grim. But if you look closer, you might spot something fun, those little notes in the margins we talked about. One monk might grumble, "My hand is frozen prey for spring." Another might doodle a tiny dragon chasing its tail. These quirks show the human side of the story. These guys weren't robots. They were stuck in chilly rooms, fighting cramps and boredom, all to keep the past alive. It's kind of endearing, like finding a sticky note from your great-grandpa in an old book. But let's not get too cozy. Monasteries had their limits, and not everyone's a fan. Some historians say they dropped the ball by obsessing over religious texts. Sure, they saved Aristotle, but they weren't exactly racing to copy every wild idea from the ancient world. If a text didn't fit the church's vibe, like, say, a pagan philosopher questioning Godot, might get left on the cutting room floor. And innovation, not always a priority. Monasteries were more about looking back than pushing forward. Imagine a museum curator who's great at dusting old statues, but doesn't care about new art. That's the vibe. Still, without them, we'd have a lot less to dust off today. So what did this mean for the folks outside? Picture a village a mile from this monastery. The people there are farmers, weavers, maybe a blacksmith, busy folks with muddy boots, and no time for Latin lessons. They might hear a monk preach, his voice booming from a pulpit, but the words are a mystery. Reading, writing, that's wizard stuff, reserved for the cloistered few. It's not that they didn't want to learn. Life just didn't give them the chance. Monasteries kept the flame of knowledge burning, but it was a tiny flicker, not a bonfire for all to gather around. Yet, there is more to the story. Monasteries weren't totally cut off. Some opened their doors, a crack running small schools for local boys who showed promise, or letting lay brothers help in the scriptorium. These were baby steps, but they mattered. And beyond books, monasteries were like medieval think tanks. They tinkered with crop rotation, brewed herbal remedies, even built water mills. Ever heard of Benedictine monks and their famous liqueur? That's the kind of practical know-how that leaked out bit by bit into the world. Their chronicles, those detailed logs of daily life, are gold mines for us today, full of everything from weather reports to royal gossip. Back in the scriptorium, Brother Cedric's wrapping up his page. He stretches, his joints popping like firewood, and you can see the pride in his tired eyes. Each line he's written is a lifeline to the past, but it's also a barrier to the present. That's the monastery's legacy, a double-edged sword. They rescued knowledge from the jaws of chaos, but they held it tight, sharing only whispers with the world beyond their walls. It's a tale of sacrifice and control, of ink-stained hands and locked doors. And as you step out into the fading light, the monastery behind you feels like a riddle. It saved so much, yet gave so little away. The bell tolls again, steady and sure. But there's a shift in the air, something's coming. Because next we're diving into the clash of languages, Latin versus the vernacular, the church's tongue against the people's voice. It's a fight that'll crack these walls wide open, and you won't want to miss it. So settle in, dream big, and let's keep this history rolling. Picture this: you've just slipped out of the monastery from last time, leaving behind the flickering candles and the rustle of parchment. The door thuds shut, and suddenly you're in a medieval town, the air buzzing with life. The streets a mess of churned up mud, and it smells like a mix of fresh bread, sweaty horses, and something you'd rather not step in. Voices swirl around you, merchants haggling kids, laughing a stray rooster, crowing like it owns the place. They're all speaking the local lingo, something like Old English or Middle French, rough and ready. But then cutting through the chatter comes a priest's voice, lofty and Latin preaching from the church steps. Most folks just stare blankly. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where language decides who's in and who's out. Let's rewind a bit. Back in the monastery, those monks were busy copying books and guarding knowledge, like dragons hoarding gold. But out here in the real world, there's a catch. Almost everything worth reading is in Latin. It's the language of the church, the law, the big thinkers, the medieval equivalent of a secret handshake. If you don't speak it, you're stuck on the outside, peering through the window at a party you can join. Imagine walking into a tavern where the menus, in some ancient tongue you've never heard, good luck figuring out if you're ordering stew or a side of regret. So why was Latin the king of the hill? It's a leftovers from the Romans kind of story. The Roman Empire spread Latin far and wide, and when it fell apart, the church picked up the pieces. Latin became the glue holding Europe together. Priests from Spain to Scotland could trade ideas without a translator, and sacred texts stayed the same everywhere. Handy, right? Except for one problem. Nobody spoke Latin in their everyday life. Your local baker wasn't yelling panem meum to sell his loaves. He was shouting in the vernacular, the people's language, the one that rolled off the tongue naturally. Here's where it gets tricky. Learning Latin wasn't like picking up a few phrases for a vacation. It was a full-on commitment, years of study, starting young, with a monk or tutor breathing down your neck. Picture a room full of boys, probably wishing they were anywhere else, chanting Amo Amas Amat until their heads hurt. Who got this golden ticket? Mostly sons of nobles, rich merchants, or kids earmarked for the priesthood. Everyone else, the farmer, the weaver, the girl spinning wool by the fire, was out of luck. Latin was a wall, and climbing it took time and money most people didn't have. Think about it like this. What if today, every book, every law, every cool idea was locked behind, say, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs? Sure, you could crack it with a decade of lessons and a pile of gold, but who's got that lying around? Back then, literacy wasn't just a skill, it was a privilege, and Latin was the gatekeeper. For the majority, reading and writing were as distant as the star spready to look at, impossible to touch. Now don't get me wrong, the vernacular languages weren't dead in the water. They were alive, kicking, and everywhere you turned. Step into that town square again. You hear a woman bartering for apples in her native tongue, a storyteller spinning a yarn about a dragon, a song floating from an open window. These were the heartbeat of daily life. But when it came to writing, the bigwigs, scholars, priests, king sniffed at the vernacular like it was a muddy boot at a fancy ball. Latin was the polished marble. The local dialects were just gravel, so books stayed. Latin sermons stayed Latin. And the gap between the haves and have-nots grew wider. That doesn't mean the vernacular never got its moment. Sometimes it snuck through the cracks. Ever heard of Beowulf? That epic tale of monsters and mead halls was scribbled down in Old English, not Latin, back around the 8th century. Or take a wild fact, the oldest known sentence in Old English etched on a 7th century gold coin says, "This she-wolf is a reward to my kinsman." No one's quite sure what it means. Maybe a cryptic medieval flex, but it's proof the vernacular could leave a mark. Fast forward to the 14th century, and Dante Divine Comedy struts onto the scene in Italian, not Latin, like a rebel crashing a stuffy party. These were rare wins, though. Most of the time, Latin kept the spotlight. So what did this mean for literacy? It stayed low, think single digits low. Maybe 5 to 10% of folks could read anything at all, and even fewer could write. If everything's in Latin and you don't speak it, why bother? Reading was for the clergy, the clerks, the elite people with a job that needed it. For everyone else, life was too busy for parchment dreams. But here's a twist. In some places, like growing trade towns, the rules started bending. A merchant might jot down a deal in the vernacular, or a craftsman might scratch his name on a tool. It wasn't fancy, but it was a spark. Let's zoom in on that shift. Imagine you're back in the marketplace, the air thick with the tang of fish and the clink of coins. It's the later Middle Ages, now say the 1300, and things are getting interesting. Trade's booming and a new crowd's rising. Shopkeepers, traders, folks with a bit of coin and ambition. They're not monks, but they need to read a contract or tally their goods. Latin's still the boss, but the vernacular's creeping in on signs and letters, even in cheeky poems. It's like the underdog finally getting a line in the play. In England, after the Normans crashed the party, you've got French for the nobles, Latin for the church, and English for the resta, linguistic stew that's starting to bubble over. Here's a laugh for you. Imagine trying to keep up in a trilingual town. You're haggling in English, the tax collectors barking in French, and the priests droning in Latin. It's like a medieval version of ordering coffee in 3 apps at once. Confusing, but you muddle through. Language was power, and the lines were drawn deep. Still, for most the real knowledge, imagine stepping out of the chaotic medieval town we left behind last time, where languages tangled like a knot of yarn. The dirt road stretches ahead, curving toward a hill, crowned with stone buildings, their spires reaching up like they're trying to tickle the clouds. This isn't just any settlement, it's a university, one of the first ever, and it's about to turn the medieval world upside down. So grab a seat on this imaginary wagon, and let's roll into a time when learning started to break free from its chains. Let's drop into Bologna, Italy, around the late 12th century, where one of the earliest universities is buzzing like a beehive. The streets are a whirlwind of motion. Scholars in dark robes hustle by, clutching scrolls or arguing loudly about some obscure point of law. The air's thick with the scent of ink-old parchment and maybe a whiff of last night's stew from a student tavern. Inside the lecture halls, it's a symphony of chaos. Professors bark in Latin, students scratch notes on wax tablets, and every so often a debate erupts like a mini volcano. It's a medieval college campus. Think late-night study sessions, bad food, and a whole lot of big ideas. Why does this matter? Well, up until now, education's been the church's private playground. Want to learn to read? Join a monastery. Want to study anything beyond prayers? Good luck. Cathedral schools were pretty much Bible Studies 101 on repeat. But universities are crashing the party. They're rolling out a menu of subjects law for the sharp-tongued medicine, for the curious philosophy for the dreamers. You don't have to be a future priest anymore. Suddenly, a merchant's son or a noble's daughter will occasionally can snag a spot. It's like the Middle Ages finally got a choose-your-own adventure book for learning. Picture a kid named Elena, a rarity in this man's world. Her dad's a wealthy trader who's bet big on her brains. She's trekking to Paris, her cloak muddy from days on the road, her heart pounding as she steps into the university quarter. She's here to study medicine, not because she wants to be a nun, but because she's fascinated by how bones knit and fevers break. Elena's days are a blur of lectures and candlelit reading, her nights filled with arguments about whether bloodletting's genius or nonsense. For her, this place is a lifeline, a chance to be more than a wife or a shadow. It's tough, but it's hers. Now, don't get me wrong, universities aren't handing out diplomas to every farmer's kid. They're exclusive, expensive, and still mostly a boys' club. Tuition's a jumble of fees. Pay your professor, pay for books, pay to not freeze in your rented room. If you're broke, you might end up serenading strangers, for coins a medieval busker, with a lute and a sob story. And the dorms. Imagine a leaky attic, with a straw bed, 6 roommates, and a smell that make a pig blush. It's not glamorous, but for those who make it, it's a ticket to a bigger world. Here's where the magic happens. Universities are shaking up what people learn. Forget chanting psalms all day. Students are digging into questions like, what's a fair law? Or, how do stars move? They're cracking open Aristotle, sparring over logic, and sneaking glances at texts the church might not love. Professors are the rock stars of this scene, pulling crowds with their wit and wild theories. It's like a medieval podcast, but with more shouting and fewer ads. And then there's the book. Boom! Universities are turning into translation factories, with scholars like Adelard of Bath hunched over Greek and Arabic manuscripts, wrestling them into Latin. Euclid's geometry, Avicenna's medicine, it's all flooding back into Europe like a dam bursting. These aren't just dusty old pages. They're rocket fuel for new ideas. Universities aren't just teaching. They're rewriting the playbook, stitching together a past Europe had forgotten. Let's zoom in on literacy. As universities grow, so does the need to read and write. It's not just monks anymore. Lawyers need contracts. Doctors need charts. Clerks need ledgers. Literacy's turning into a must-have skill, not a monk-only perk. In university towns like Oxford or Salamanca, maybe 20 or 30% of folks can read way more than the 5% in some backwater hamlet. It's still mostly the rich and connected, but the circle's widening. Every quill-scratching parchment is a little nudge toward a more lettered world. Language gets a shake-up too. Latin's still king, but local tongues are creeping in. Students jot notes in French or Italian, whisper jokes in German. It's small, but it's a crack in the wall. Centuries later, that crack will split wide open, letting knowledge spill into everyday life. Universities are the first push the pebble that starts the avalanche. But it's not all serious stuff. Students back then, total troublemakers. They're staging fake trials for stray dogs brawling with townsfolk or dodging rent like it's a sport. Imagine a pack of scholars sneaking into a rival's room to swipe his lecture notes. Medieval pranks hit different. Locals called them clerks, with a groan, half annoyed, half amused. It's proof that college chaos is timeless, whether it's 1200 or 2023. Step back and look at Elena again, scribbling under a flickering lamp. She's part of something huge. The church still casts a long shadow, but universities are carving out space for questions, for new voices, for a world where ideas don't need a priest's stamp. It's slow, messy, and uneven, but it's the start of something unstoppable. And speaking of unstoppable, there's a storm brewing, one that'll make university debates look like a picnic. Next time, we'll dive into the Black Death, where chaos cracks everything open, even the books. For now, let the hum of the lecture halls fade and dream of a time when learning took its first big leap. Picture this. It's 1348, and you're a peasant in a lively medieval town. The marketplace hums with chatter. The blacksmith's hammer rings out, and the air carries the earthy scent of freshly turned soil. Life's tough, sure, but it's predictable until rumors slink through the cobblestone streets like a thief in the night. Word is a ship just docked, and it's not unloading wine or wool, but something far worse, a sickness that kills faster than you can say God save us. The Black Death has landed, and it's about to rewrite your world in ways you'd never expect. Sure, it's a grim tale of death and despair, but stick with me, there's a surprising twist ahead, one that lights a tiny spark for literacy in the darkest of times. Let's paint the scene. The Black Death isn't some minor sniffle, a full-on catastrophe, a pandemic that tears through Europe like a storm through a flimsy hut. Between 1347 and 1351, it claims 30 to 50% of the population. That's right, Imogen, half the people you know gone. Towns once alive with the clatter of carts and the laughter of children fall silent, save for the mournful clang of church bells and the wails of those left behind. Streets turn into ghost trails, lined with boarded-up houses, while fields stretch empty, their workers buried or fled. The smell, a choking mix of rot and smoke from the pyres burning day and night. It's chaos, terror, and loss on a scale you can barely wrap your head around. But here's where it gets wild. Amid all this doom, something unexpected starts to stir. See, before the plague hit, life was rigid. If you were a peasant, and most folks, where you toiled under a lord's thumb, scraping by on meager wages, your days a blur of mud and sweat. Education. That was for monks and nobles, not for the likes of you. Books were treasures, painstakingly copied by hand, costing more than you'd earn in a lifetime. Universities, as we talked about last time, were buzzing hubs of learning, but they were worlds away from your plow and pitchfork. Then the Black Death sweeps in, and suddenly everything shifts. How so? Well, with half the population wiped out, there's a massive labor shortage. Fields need tending, goods need hauling, but there just aren't enough hands to go around. Survivors like you find yourselves in a rare spot. You're in demand. Lords who once treated you like dirt are now offering higher wages, better land deals, anything to keep their estates from crumbling. It's not a fortune, but it's more than you've ever had. For the first time, you've got a little breathing room, maybe even a few extra coins to spare. And what do you do with that? Some of you start eyeing things you never could before, like sending a kid to learn their letters, or picking up a cheap prayer book from a traveling scribe. This shift doesn't stop with wages. The demand for books, simple ones, at least, starts to creep up. Before, manuscripts were locked away in monasteries or hoarded by the rich, but now, with more folks having a bit of cash, there's a market for something easier to get. Scribes and early printers, still a ways off, mind you, begin to see an opportunity. It's not like everyone's suddenly reading Chaucer by candlelight, but the idea of owning a book isn't quite as absurd as it once was. Literacy's still a luxury, don't get me wrong, but the plague cracks open the door just enough for a few more people to peek inside. Then there's the church, the big player in all things knowledge. The plague hits them hard. Too, priests and monks drop like flies, leaving parishes and monasteries half empty. In some places, entire religious houses are abandoned, their scriptoriums gathering dust. The church, scrambling to keep things running, starts bending the rules a bit. Maybe they let a literate layperson step in to read the Mass or teach the basics to kids. It's not a free-for-all. Latin's still the holy tongue, And the Bible's not exactly bedtime reading, but it's a start. More people get a taste of the written word, and that taste sticks. Now let's talk about the headspace of it all. Death's everywhere, and it's got people thinking. You're watching neighbors carted off, wondering if you're next, and it's enough to make anyone ponder life's big mysteries. Some pray harder, some clutch lucky charms, but others turn to books, anything, to make sense of the madness. Maybe it's a doctor's scribbled notes on the plague, or a monk's musings on mortality. Reading becomes a lifeline, a way to wrestle with the fear and find some shred of meaning. It's not a mass movement, but it's a spark, and sparks can grow. Historians, of course, love to argue about this. Some say the Black Death was a turning point, shaking up the old order and planting seeds for the Renaissance down the road. Others shrug and say literacy barely budged, that it took centuries more to really take off. They're both right in a way. The plague didn't turn Europe into a nation of bookworms overnight, but it nudged things along, loosened the soil for later growth, you might say. It's a slow burn, not a wildfire, but it's there. Here's a weird little aside to lighten things up in the panic. Some folks pointed fingers at cats. Yep, cats, those fluffy little hunters, were branded as plague bringers linked to witches or the devil himself. People started killing them off, which in hindsight was a terrible idea. Cats kept the rats in check, and rats well. They were the real MVPs of the plague, spreading it via fleas. So, in a cosmic facepalm, the cat purge might be made things worse. Moral of the story, don't mess with the kitties. Fast forward a bit. The plague's grip loosens, and you're still here, standing in a quieter, emptier world. The town's not what it was, but there's a new rhythm to life. You've got a little more in your pocket, a little more, say, in your fate, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to learn something beyond the daily grind. It's not paradise, but it's a shift, a ripple that'll keep spreading. And that ripple, it's about to meet a wave. Because while the Black Death was a local nightmare, the Crusades are coming, and they're going to fling open the gates to far-off lands, stirring up cultures, ideas, and yes, even more books. That's the next chapter, though, so for now, let the echoes of the bells fade and drift off, knowing that even in the bleakest moments, something new can begin. Imagine a crisp morning in 1096, the horizon streaked with the first light of dawn. A knight named Baldwin stands at the edge of a bustling port, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air buzzes with the clatter of armor, the creak of ships, and the low hum of prayers from a huddle of pilgrims nearby. Baldwin's about to set off on the First Crusade, a mission to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim hands. His sword's sharp, his resolve is steely, but he has no idea that this journey is going to be more than a clash of steel. It's going to fling open a window to a world of ideas, technologies, and cultures he's never imagined. The Crusades, it turns out, aren't just about holy wars. They're about to become a medieval mashup of discovery and exchange. Let's set the stage. The Crusades kicked off when Pope Urban II rallied Europe with a fiery speech urging Christians to take back the Holy Land. From 1096 to the late 1200s, wave after wave of crusaders, knights, peasants, even a tragically misguided band of kids headed east. Sure, there was plenty of fighting, but here's the unexpected twist: these expeditions turned into a cultural crossroads. Think of it as a medieval road trip, where the souvenirs weren't just trinkets, but whole libraries of knowledge. As we saw with the Black Death, Big events can shake things up in surprising ways, and the Crusades are no different. They're about to sprinkle some serious sparkle on Europe's dusty, intellectual scene. So what happens when Baldwin and his crew land in the Middle East? They're stepping into a dazzling world. While Europe's been stumbling through the aftermath of Rome's fall, Islamic civilizations have been on a roll, guarding the flame of ancient Greek and Roman wisdom, while adding their own brilliant twists. Picture Baldwin, gawking at a marketplace in Damascus or Jerusalem. Merchants, hawk silks and spices astronomers, peer through gleaming astrolabes, and scholars scribble equations that make Europe's old tally sticks look like child's play. It's a sensory overload, colors, smells, and ideas swirling together like a medieval kaleidoscope. One of the flashiest imports Arabic numerals. Yep, those handy digits 1, 2, 3 that we take for granted today. Back in Europe, folks were still wrestling with Roman numerals X55, like they were solving a riddle just to add 2 cows to 3 sheep. The Middle East had inherited these sleek numbers from India, and crusaders snatched them up like the latest gadget. Bringing them home wasn't instant. Medieval Wi-Fi was pretty slow, but once they caught on, they flipped math on its head. Suddenly, merchants could tally profits without a headache, and builders could measure arches without a meltdown. It's the kind of upgrade that makes you wonder how anyone survived without it. But numbers are just the start. The Crusades unlock a treasure chest of lost texts. Ancient Greek bigwigs like Aristotle and Ptolemy had been chilling in Arabic translations tucked away in libraries from Baghdad to Cordoba. Now, they're making their way back to Europe, often through hubs like Toledo, where translators burn the midnight oil, turning Arabic into Latin. Imagine a monk hunched over a desk, his candle flickering as he decodes a page of Euclid's geometry. It's painstaking, but it's a lifeline. Ideas that had been snoozing for centuries are waking up, ready to rattle the cages of European thought. Then there's the tech hall. Crusaders stumble across gadgets and tricks that Europe's never seen. Windmills, for instance, those spinning wonders from the Middle East start dotting the European landscape, grinding grain with a breeze. The compass, another Eastern gem, slips into sailors' hands, letting them chase horizons they'd only dreamed of. And in the doctor's tent, things get wild. Islamic physicians like Avicenna have written medical encyclopedias that blow Europe's herbal guesswork out of the water. A knight with a slashed arm might grumble about the stitches, but he's secretly impressed by the know-how. It's like the Crusades packed a suitcase full of upgrades and shipped it home. Trade's the glue that ties it all together. The Crusades chisel out new paths, roads, sea lanes, you name it, linking east and west like never before. Ports like Venice and Genoa turn into boom towns, ships groaning with silk, saffron, and scrolls. A merchant might barter for a bag of cloves and toss in a book of Persian poetry for good measure. Knowledge hitches a ride on these trade winds, sneaking into Europe bit by bit. It's not a tidal wave, literacy's still a luxury, but it's a steady drip soaking into the cracks of a society that's ready for something new. Here's a fun tidbit: the Crusades even spice up the dinner table. Soldiers and travelers come back with recipes. Think sticky sweet baklava, or a cool gulp of sherbet straight from the Middle East. Picture Baldwin back from the fray, kicking off his boots and digging into a pastry, muttering, "Well, that's worth the sunburn." It's a tiny piece of the puzzle, but it shows how exchange isn't just about brainy stuff, it's about the flavors of life too. Back in Europe, the timing couldn't be better. After the Black Death tore through, people are itching for a reboot. Those universities we mentioned, they're popping up like mushrooms, and they're starving for fresh material. The haul from the Crusades books, Ideas Tools, feeds that hunger sparking debates and lighting fuses. It's not a total makeover. Most folks still can't read their own name, but it's a nudge, a whisper that there's more out there. The Crusades are like a match struck in the dark, flickering just enough to hint at what's ahead. Historians love to bicker about this. Some say the Crusades were a footnote, that Europe would have stumbled onto this stuff anyway. Others call it a turbo boost, jump-starting a sleepy continent. Truth is, it's a bit of both. The Crusades didn't invent the Renaissance, but they tossed some logs on the fire, keeping it smoldering until the flames could really roar. Let's circle back to Baldwin. Hes home now, his shield scratched, his worldview stretched. Hes seen domes that scrape the sky, heard languages that dance, and glimpsed a world that's bigger than his village ever hinted. Europe's changing too slowly, messily, but surely. The Crusades have spun a web of connections, and those threads are pulling tight. And speaking of pulling, there's a new crowd stirring in the towns, merchants, craftsmen, a scrappy middle class with big dreams. They're about to grab this spark of knowledge and fan it into something wild. But that's a story for tomorrow night. For now, let the echoes of Baldwin's journey fade, the clink of armor soften and drift off, with the murmur of distant shores in your dreams. Imagine you're perched on a wooden stool in a dusty corner of a medieval tavern, the kind where the floor's sticky with spilled ale and the air hums with the chatter of travelers. The fire's crackling, throwing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, and across the room a group of merchants is huddled over a table, their voices low but lively. They're not swapping tales of knights or saints tonight. No, they're arguing over a scrap of parchment, a contract scribbled in a language they can almost understand. Welcome back to the world of the middle class, where the rise of towns trade and ambition is cracking open the dusty old chest of literacy and letting its treasures spill into unexpected hands. Last time we met Thomas, our sharp-eyed merchant, and Agnes the weaver with a guild charter she can't quite read. They're part of a growing crowd, people who aren't content to let the clergy and nobles hoard all the words. This isn't just about keeping ledgers or signing deals, though that's where it starts. It's about a shift, a rumble underfoot, as the middle class begins to see literacy as a tool they can wield, not just a privilege they admire from afar. Let's stroll back to the marketplace, where the morning sun glints off barrels of wine and stacks of wool. Thomas is there, squinting at a tally stick, a notched piece of wood that tracks his debts and deliveries. It's clever, but it's crude, like trying to paint a portrait with a lump of charcoal. He's heard of something better, parchment ledgers from the Italian cities, where merchants in Florence and Venice scribble every sale in books they can flip through later. It's a lifeline for a man whose trade stretches from the muddy ports of England to the spice-scented docks of the Mediterranean. But to use it, he needs to learn the trick of turning squiggles into meaning. This hunger for literacy isn't unique to Thomas. Across Europe, the middle class is waking up to the power of the written word. Picture a bustling port town like Bruges, where ships groan under cargoes of cloth and timber. Here a merchant named Willem is teaching his daughter Elsa to scratch out numbers and names. She's only 12, but she's quick. And Willem knows she'll need those skills when she inherits his contacts and his contracts. It's a quiet rebellion. Girls weren't supposed to meddle with ink and quills, but Willem's not one for old rules when new profits are at stake. Now let's duck into a narrow street lined with workshops. The air's thick with the tang of leather and the clack of looms. Here's where the artisans live, folks like Agnes and her guildmates. These guilds are more than just clubs. They're powerhouses, setting prices, training apprentices, and guarding secrets of the trade. But those secrets are starting to pile up on parchment, not just in whispers. Take the Bakers Guild, they've got a list of recipes, fines for bad bread, and rules about who can sell where. It's all written down, but half the bakers can't read it. So they club together, hiring a scruffy lad with a quill to teach their kids the basics. It's not fancy no Latin hymns or monkish chants, just enough to decipher a page and keep the guild humming. This push for learning isn't smooth, mind you. It's messy, full of stumbles and laughs. Picture a cobbler's son, Jacob, hunched over a scrap of vellum, his tongue poking out as he tries to write shoes and ends up with sous. His mates snicker, but his father beams, because even a wobbly sous is a step toward running the shop someday. These little blunders are the sound of a world tilting of literacy, slipping out of the cloisters and into the calloused hands of the everyday. But why does this matter? Why are Thomas, Elsa, and Jacob poking at something that's been locked away for centuries? It's the towns you see, those sprawling, smoky hubs where trade and craft are rewriting the rules. Back in the days of castles and plowshares, life was simple. Nobles fought, peasants worked, and monks scribbled. Now, though, towns are popping up like mushrooms after rain, and they're hungry for more than bread and ale. Trade routes snake across the continent, silk from the east, wool from England, amber from the Baltic, and they're tying people together in ways that demand records letters and deals on paper. Take banking, for instance. In places like Italy, clever folks are turning coins into promises. A merchant in Genoa hands over gold and gets a noted bill of exchange that he can cash in Paris. It's like magic, but it only works if you can read the note and trust the scribbles. Suddenly, literacy isn't just useful. It's money in your pocket, and the middle class, with their knack for spotting a good deal, aren't about to let that slip by. Let's wander to a quieter corner, where a stone building looms over the street. It's a school, not the grand universities of Paris or Bologna, not yet, but a humbler place where a tutor drills a gaggle of kids in their letters. These aren't noble brats destined for a bishop's robe. They're the sons and daughters of traders and smiths. The tutor's a bit of a grump, his robe patched and his voice sharp, but he's teaching them something new, how to write in the language they speak, not just the Latin of the church. It's a small spark, but it's catching. That shift to the vernacular, the rough, lively tongues of the streets, is like a river breaking its banks. For ages, Latin ruled the page, a language so lofty it floated above the common folk. But now, the middle class is tugging it down to earth. In Italy, merchants are jotting notes in Tuscan dialects. In England, they're scratching out deals in early English. It's not pretty or polished, but it works. And then come the poets Dante, with his Divine Comedy Chaucer, with his Canterbury Tales, spinning tales in words that hum with the rhythm of the tavern and the market. These aren't dusty tomes for monks. They're stories for people who haggle and hammer and dream. This isn't to say everyone's reading by candlelight just yet. Most folks still can't, and parchment's pricey, think of it, like buying a smartphone today, but without the shiny screen. Still, the middle class is prying open the door. They're not storming castles or toppling kings, but they're doing something sneakier. They're making knowledge a little less sacred and a lot more useful. And there's a whiff of something bigger in the air. Step into a workshop where a tinkerer's fiddling with wooden blocks, carving letters to stamp out a page. It's slow, clumsy workwood block. Printing, they call it, but it's a hint of what's coming. The middle class, with their growing numbers, and restless energy are laying the kindling. When Gutenberg rolls in with his printing press, a century later, they'll be the ones ready to fan the flames, turning a trickle of books into a flood. For now, though, let's linger in the tavern a bit longer. The merchants are still at it, puzzling over their contract. One of them, maybe Thomas, grins and says, "If I can't read it, it'll just make the other fellow sign twice." The table erupts in laughter, but there's a glint in his eye. His joking sure, but he's also scheming. Maybe it's time to hire that tutor to crack those squiggles himself. It's a small moment, a flicker of mischief, but it's the middle class in a nutshell, practical, scrappy, and ready to rewrite the rules. As the fire dies down and the tavern quiets, you can almost hear it, the rustle of parchment, the scratch of a quill, the murmur of a world stretching its wings. The middle class is rising, and they're bringing literacy along for the ride. It's not loud, not yet, but it's steady, like the beat of a drum in the distance. And soon, very soon, that beat will quicken, ushering in a new age where words aren't just for the few, but for the many. Next time, we'll chase that drumbeat into the Renaissance, where the world explodes with color art and ideas. But for now, let the tavern fade, the clink of mugs, the creak of benches, the promise of tomorrow, and rest easy in a world on the cusp. Imagine you're standing on the edge of a sleepy medieval village, the kind we've wandered through before, muddy paths, thatched roofs, and the distant toll of a church bell. The air's thick with the smell of wood smoke, and most folks around you can't tell a quill from a plow. But now, take a deep breath, because the wind's shifting. It's carrying whispers of something new, something big. You blink, and suddenly you're in a bustling city, Florence, Italy, around the late 14th century. The streets are alive with color, merchants hawk silks, painters splash canvases, and a strange clanking noise echoes from a workshop nearby. This, my friends, is the Renaissance. Time when the world woke up, rubbed its eyes, and decided it was time to read, think, and dream in a whole new way. Let's rewind just a bit to understand where we're coming from. In the Middle Ages, life was like a locked treasure chest. Knowledge was inside, but only a few had the key. Books were treasures themselves, handwritten by monks who hunched over desks for years, copying every word in Latin, a language most people couldn't understand. If you weren't a priest or a noble, your chances of reading were about as good as winning a jousting match against a dragon. But as trade grew and towns swelled, a middle class started to rise, people like merchants and craftsmen who wanted in on the action. They were hungry for more than bread. They wanted stories, ideas, and a way to make sense of the world. The Renaissance was about to serve up a feast. So what kicked this off? Picture Italy as the spark that lit the fire. Around the 1300s, scholars there started digging into the past, unearthing scrolls and statues from ancient Greece and Rome. It was like finding a time capsule full of big ideas about art, science, and what it means to be human. This movement called humanism flipped the script. Instead of just praying for a better tomorrow, people began celebrating today, asking questions, exploring nature, and scribbling it all down. But ideas don't spread on their own. They needed a megaphone, and that's where a clever German named Johannes Gutenberg comes in. Fast forward to the 1440s and step into Gutenberg's workshop. It's a mess of wood and metal, with ink-stained rags scattered around. Hez tinkering with a contraption that looks part printing machine, part medieval torture device, the printing press. Before this, making a book was like carving a statue out of marble, slow, expensive, and one of a kind. Now Gutenberg's press could stamp out pages faster than a baker kneading dough. By pressing movable metal type onto paper, he turned books from rare gems into something you could actually hold without selling your cow. It was the world's first mass production miracle, and it was about to blow the doors off literacy. Let's linger in that workshop for a moment. The press groans as it cranks out a Paglia crisp black-inked sheet of the Bible, but not in Latin this time. It's in German, the everyday tongue of farmers and shopkeepers. That's the Renaissance magic, taking knowledge off its high horse and handing it to the people. Soon, presses are popping up across Europe, Venice, Paris, London, churning out everything from prayer books to poetry. It's like the internet crashing into the 15th century, only with more ink and fewer cat videos. For the first time, a tailor's apprentice could snag a book on a market stall, and a baker's daughter could puzzle out a fairy tale by candlelight. But it's not just about more books. It's about what's inside them. The Renaissance was a playground for dreamers and doers. Take Leonardo da Vinci, part artist, part mad scientist. He's sketching flying machines and dissecting frogs, filling notebooks with wild ideas that spill across the page like a river. Or Michelangelo chiseling marble into statues that seem to breathe, all while scribbling sonnets on the side. These weren't just pretty pictures or clever words. They were sparks that lit up minds. And thanks to the printing press, their works could travel, bouncing from Florence to Frankfurt, inspiring others to pick up a brush, a pen, or a telescope. Walk with me through a Renaissance city. The air buzzes with energy. In one corner, a printer's apprentice is stacking freshly pressed pages, the ink still wet. Across the square, a scholar shouting about a new theory, maybe that the Earth spins around the sun, which sounds crazy, but kinda cool. Nearby, a crowd's gawking at a painter who's turning a blank wall into a masterpiece. It's chaos, but it's beautiful chaos, a world where creativity and curiosity are king. And literacy. It's the glue holding it all together. People aren't just reading. They're talking back, writing their own stories and passing them around like hot gossip. Let's talk numbers for a second. Back in the Middle Ages, maybe 5 to 10% of folks in Europe could read, mostly monks and lords. By the end of the Renaissance, in bustling cities like Florence or Amsterdam, that jumps to 20 or 30%. It's not everyone, but it's a leap. And it's not just about who can read, it's about who wants to. Books are becoming cheaper, yes, but they're also becoming irresistible. Printers like Aldus Manutius in Venice start making these sleek pocket-sized editions. Think of them as the paperbacks of their day. They're stylish, affordable, and perfect for showing off at the tavern. Suddenly, owning a book isn't just practical. It's a statement. But it's not all sunshine and sonnets. The Renaissance had its gatekeepers. The church, for one, wasn't thrilled about every Tom, Dick, and Harry reading the Bible for themselves, especially when folks like Martin Luther started printing ideas that poked holes in the old rules. And while cities buzzed with books, rural villages often stayed in the dark, too far from the presses and the buzz. Still, the tide was turning. Literacy was creeping into new corners, carried by merchants, travelers, and the occasional nosy neighbor. Now, let's zoom out and think big. The Renaissance wasn't just a party for artists and bookworms. It was a launch pad. All those printed pages, those maps, those equations, those wild theories set the stage for what's coming next. Scientists like Galileo start peering at the stars, writing books that make the universe feel a little less mysterious. Explorers like Columbus, love him or hate him, sail off with maps and journals in hand, fueled by that same thirst for discovery. It's the dawn of a new way of thinking, and literacy's the spark that keeps the fire burning. Picture yourself back in Florence as the sun sets painting the sky gold. The city hums with life, the clatter of the press, the murmur of a debate, the scratch of a quill on paper. You can feel it. This is a world waking up. Books aren't just objects anymore. They're bridges connecting people to ideas, to each other, to the future. And as the stars peek out, you know this is just the beginning. The Renaissance is lighting a path on that'll lead to revolutions, revelations, and a world where knowledge isn't a privilege but a right. So tuck that thought under your pillow tonight. The Renaissance isn't just a history lesson. It's a reminder that when we open a book, we open a door. And who knows what's waiting on the other side? Imagine yourself perched on a hillside gazing out over a medieval valley as the sun begins its slow descent. Shadows stretch across the patchwork of fields where peasants bend over their plows, and the faint chime of a church bell drifts on the evening breeze. It's a world alive with sound and color, yet one where the rustle of a book's pages is as rare as a comet streaking across the sky. As we've traveled through this age together, we've pieced together a puzzle. Why were people in the Middle Ages less literate, less likely to cradle a book in their hands? Now, with the day winding down, let's step back and see how these pieces fit, how they built a world where words were treasures few could touch. The church and the locked gates of knowledge. Picture the church as a grand castle, its walls lined with shelves of manuscripts, each one glowing with the labor of a monk's quill. It was the keeper of learning a lighthouse in the darkness of the early Middle Ages. But that light shone only for a select few. Most books were written in Latin, a language as distant to the common folk as the stars above their thatched roofs. Education was the church's domain, reserved for priests, monks, and the occasional noble son. For the rest bakers, weavers, farmers, the written word was a sacred mystery glimpsed only through stained glass windows or the echo of a sermon. The song of the spoken word. Now shift your gaze to the village square where a storyteller spins a tale by the flicker of a fire. In this world, stories didn't live on pages, they danced in the air. The oral tradition was the heartbeat of the Middle Ages, a library without walls. Grandmothers whispered legends to wide-eyed children. Minstrels sang of heroes, and workers traded proverbs over their tools. It was beautiful, alive, and free, but fragile. Without ink to pin them down, these tales could shift like shadows, leaving knowledge as fleeting as a dream. Books, meanwhile, sat silent and distant, out of reach for those who lived by the spoken word. The feudal ladder and the weight of the land. Look closer at the fields below, where the feudal system carved life into unyielding lines. Peasants were the backbone of this world, their days swallowed by the rhythm of sowing and reaping. Reading, writing. These were luxuries they couldn't afford, not in time nor in purpose. Their lords and ladies might have had the chance to learn, but even for them, power came from land and loyalty, not letters. The system was a chain binding most to the soil, and keeping education a privilege for the top rungs a distant prize like a hawk soaring above the treetops. Books, jewels of ink and parchment. Now imagine holding a medieval book in your hands. Feel its weight, the parchment stiff and crinkly, the ink dark and deliberate. Every page was a small miracle born from the skin of a sheep and the months-long toil of a scribe. These weren't objects you'd find tucked under a farmer's arm. They were treasures often worth more than a family's yearly bread. chained to monastery shelves or locked in noble halls. Books were as rare as gold coins in a beggar's pouch. Their scarcity made them symbols of wealth and status, not tools for the everyday. The missing magic of the printing press. What kept books so scarce? The absence of a single invention, the printing press. Without it, every word had to be scratched out by hand, a process so slow it could make a snail look swift. There was no way to churn out copies, no way to scatter knowledge like seeds on the wind. Each book was a singleton, a lone star in a vast sky, and that rarity locked literacy away from the masses. It was a world waiting for a spark on that wouldn't ignite until centuries later. Education's narrow path. Let's wander to the edge of a monastery where young boys hunch over desks, tracing Latin letters under a monk's stern eye. Education existed, yes, but it was a narrow bridge open, only to boys, and only to those bound for the church or born to privilege. The curriculum was rigid scripture grammar, a dash of logic. For the rest of society girls, peasants, craftsmen, learning came from life, not lessons. Knowledge was a walled garden, and most stood outside its gates peering through the cracks. Monasteries, guardians, and gatekeepers. Inside those monastery walls, monks were the unsung heroes of the written word. They copied texts with a patience that bordered on the divine saving wisdom from the dust of time. But there was a catch they didn't share freely. Books stayed within the stone walls, lent only to the worthy clergy scholars, the occasional noble. It was a noble effort preserving the past, but it also kept the present in the dark, hoarding light instead of spreading it. The wall of Latin. And then there was language itself, a towering hurdle. Latin was the tongue of learning a code that locked out anyone who spoke the rough, rich vernacular of the fields and streets. To read a book, you had to master a language that wasn't yours, a task as daunting as scaling a cliff with no rope. For most, it was easier to let the priests and scholars keep their secrets than to chase a skill so far removed from daily life, cracks in the stone. Yet even in this quiet world, change was stirring. Picture the first universities rising like new shoots through the soil, Oxford, Paris, Bologna, offering a taste of knowledge beyond the church's grip. The Black Death swept through, leaving chaos, but also opportunity. Survivors found their labor worth more their purses.